Over the last 2 or so years, there's obviously been a lot of new Star Wars games that have been announced, and although a lot of them look very exciting, and even some of them that were announced in games like Jedi Survivor have already been successful, I think a lot of us, including myself, are definitely still holding on hope for Battlefront 3. It seems like that is the game that everyone in the Star Wars gaming community wants, and yet today I'm actually going to be talking about why I think Battlefront 3 is actually a bad idea for any developer to take on. Now, I firstly want to clarify that I'm not really saying I don't want it or I think it would suck. Like I just said in the intro of the video, I personally do want it, and I'm not even joking when I say I would quite literally sell a kidney if it meant we could get Battlefront 3. So I'm not saying I don't want it, but I do overall think there is actually some negatives to it, which I'm going to get into in this video. This isn't so much coming from a fan perspective, it's more coming from, I guess, the perspective of a developer, and more on probably why we won't get one, rather than why obviously us fans don't want one, because the fact is that we pretty much all do. The thing with all of these new games that are on the way, maybe with the exception being the KOTOR remaster, because obviously that is remaking a game that is obviously already established, but for the rest of them, they're all pretty much brand new IPs. They're new characters in most cases. They even have a lot of new planets, even if they do involve some of the planets we already know, and they're all pretty much entirely untold stories. Because of that, they kind of have no expectations for the most part. Now, I'm not going to say no expectations, because obviously anything with the Star Wars label on it is definitely going to have high expectations, and people are always going to set their own expectations as well. But I think the thing with all of these games that are kind of new IPs within Star Wars, for example, the Jedi franchise, obviously that's not new anymore because we know Cal in 2 separate games now, but at least when they first announced that, and then also games like Outlaws, for example, these are really like a new sub IP within the Star Wars franchise. And because of that, if they don't live up to the expectations that people are setting for them, I guess there's not as much of a hit on those games, because I guess it's just a bit less of a letdown when we haven't experienced anything from that franchise just yet. Now, obviously with a game like the sequel to Jedi Survivor, that has obviously had 2 games already, so if the sequel to Jedi Survivor isn't good, that's maybe another exception where that is going to be a big letdown, because the first 2 games were obviously very solid. But when it comes to a game like Outlaws, even a game like Star Wars Hunters, these games don't have that prior expectation, and I'm sure if you are a developer, that is probably a very, very good thing. When it comes to Battlefront 3 though, there is obviously going to be so much expectation there that it is not just made up by us as fans. It's not just us, hoping for the best and hoping for the best game we can possibly get. That expectation is actually set by the previous game. So what I mean by that is that when Battlefront 2015 came out, it was overall a pretty loved game. A lot of people really, really enjoyed that game. And then they kind of went bigger with Battlefront 2, and it had more content at launch, it had more errors. It was overall just a generally better game, at least in most cases anyway. And so that right there has then set the expectation for what we know can be done between the original game and the second game. Now, let's just say they announced Battlefront 3. We're going to take the expectation that we know from the jump from Battlefront 2015 to Battlefront 2 and actually roll with that and say, okay, well, they added 4 new maps at launch in Battlefront 2 compared to in Battlefront 2015, so they're going to have to do the same again. Therefore, if Battlefront 2 had 11 maps at launch, then Battlefront 3 needs 15, or it's just not going to be a success. Battlefront 2 launched with 20 heroes and it ended up with a lot more than that, and therefore we're going to need to launch it with 30 heroes this time. That is the expectation that we're going to kind of set for Battlefront 3, not only just made up by us, but like I said, that is actually set by the developers in their previous games due to the jump in amount of content between the first game and the second game. Those expectations would be absolutely ridiculous if we do ever get a Battlefront 3. People would essentially be expecting at launch 15 or more maps, obviously, which are large scale. These aren't Call of Duty size maps, these are freaking Battlefield size maps. They'd be expecting 30 heroes, they'd be expecting 10 game modes, an absolutely perfect class system, an absolutely perfect progression system, proper monetization, probably a battle pass, and all these sorts of things. And essentially people would be expecting the best multiplayer Star Wars game we have ever gotten. Now, that is not unfair for us to actually expect that, because obviously that is based off of the previous game, and that's not really us just making that up, but it is still a very, very high expectation for any dev company to just kind of take that on and say, yep, we know everyone's going to want the best multiplayer game ever, so we have to live up to that. That is not an easy thing for any development company to do. And for me personally, I think that's why we probably aren't going to get one, at least not anytime soon, because it is such a huge undertaking. For us players, it seems like such an obvious choice. When I think about it, why on earth wouldn't you make a Battlefront 3? It's pretty much guaranteed to get like 15 million sales at an absolute minimum. If it's monetized properly, it is is literally a money printing machine. Look at all of the big games out there, the big multiplayer games that just make billions of dollars because they are ran properly. Now imagine that with Star Wars Battlefront on the title. It seems like such an obvious choice to us, and yet for the developers, it actually seems like probably a more obvious choice to just use Star Wars as an IP, but pretty much create your own sub-franchise within it to essentially just avoid all of those expectation issues. If I'm a developer and someone comes to me with two pitches, one being something like a Fallen Order, where it's just its own little franchise that is completely unknown to the fans so far, or a Battlefront 3, obviously there is some enticement there with the Battlefront 3 because it's a franchise that is set and you know that it's going to do well for sales. But on the flip side of that, there is just way too much expectation, and a lot of those dev companies probably want the one with less expectation so that there's essentially less risk involved with that project. Now, this goes for even just general multiplayer games as well. This isn't even just for a Battlefront 3. Even if like another studio came out with some other Star Wars multiplayer game that was, somewhat similar, a 10v10 multiplayer shooter within the Star Wars franchise, even that is kind of competing with the nostalgia of Battlefront 2. And even though it's a different franchise made by a different company, people would still be comparing that to Battlefront 2, even if it's not the same team who made it. Because of that, that is probably why there hasn't really been any multiplayer games announced. Star Wars Hunters is obviously on its way, but that is a little bit different because that is a multiplayer arena shooter game that is on a mobile and that is available on mobile and the Switch. So it's kind of taking up its own little market there, being only available on platforms that weren't available to be played when it came to games like Battlefront 2. We know that Respawn is working on their first-person shooter, but that even has its doubts about whether that's going to be a multiplayer game at all. When they first announced it, I thought it was definitely going to be a multiplayer game, but it is seemingly more of a single-player game that may potentially have multiplayer as well. So even Respawn, who are really, really solid at making multiplayer shooters, seem to be kind of shying away from that, and that is probably because they would be going up against Battlefront 2. Like I said, even though it's a different dev company, they would absolutely be getting compared to Battlefront 2, and there'd be some pretty unfair expectations set on that game, where if it's not better than Battlefront 2, people would just be shitting all over it. It's a bit of a tough situation because, like I said, I think all of us fans would love a Battlefront 3. I'm not joking when I said earlier, I would quite literally sell a kidney if it meant we got Battlefront 3. That is not even a joke. I would absolutely part ways with one of my organs to get this game. I think I would genuinely cry if they announced it. And so I absolutely do want it. But with that being said, I can absolutely see why developers probably don't want to make Battlefront 3, as well as even just other developers don't want to make a multiplayer game just yet, because it has absolutely huge shoes to fill. Even with a lot of the failures that Battlefront 2 had, it is such a loved game by so many people, and any game that gets made that is a multiplayer shooter, with probably the exception of Hunters, it is going to be going up against essentially the memory of Battlefront 2. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that though, and whether you think we will ever get a Battlefront 3, as well as whether you guys agree that it is potentially a bad idea for any developers to take it on, or whether you completely disagree with me and think it is the best idea that any dev team could actually take on. So be sure to leave your thoughts down in the comment section. I'm definitely keen to hear what you guys have to say. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and may the force be with you always.